This evening, I'm going to begin a teaching series dealing with the historical backdrop of Jesus Christ's life. We're going to be covering over a number of weeks of me teaching, not necessarily what the other teachers during those weeks will be doing, but when I teach for the next several weeks, I'm going to get into different aspects of the history and events that ended up shaping the world that Jesus Christ was born into and are important to understanding many of the events and people that you read about in the Gospels. Having an understanding of the historical background, the geopolitical events, the peoples, the changes in populations and governments and different things that happened during the time in the centuries really leading up to Jesus Christ's birth all contribute to what happens and what we read about in the Gospels. And many things that you perhaps don't really understand and perhaps just kind of read over when you're reading the Gospels, once you understand more of that background, will become more meaningful to you. Dealing with this will help explain such things as how those major political events shaped the world that Jesus Christ was born into and what significant effect they continued to play during his earthly ministry. How did the religious and political backdrop contribute to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion? How did the major world events affect the languages spoken, read, and understood by the Jews of New Testament times, including the scriptures themselves? Who were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes? We hear about them. You kind of draw an impression, but who were these guys? How did they come about? And when did they become such powerful people in Judea? What did they believe? How did this affect Jesus and his apostles, including the later apostles like Paul? Why were the Samaritans despised? Were they legally and spiritually part of the nation of people that Jesus was sent to? Why were the Galileans looked down on? Why did some Judeans view them as Samaritans? What events happened during the intertestamental period that had a continuing effect on the world that Jesus was born into? Intertestamental, that's what happens between the Old Testament and the New Testament. What role did synagogues play during Jesus' lifetime? Did they exist in the Old Testament times? What was the origin of the rabbinic tradition that Jesus so often confronted? What did it eventually become? So those are just some of the different questions, some of the different things that we'll deal with when we get into all of these different events. This evening, we're going to deal with events in the Old Testament that had a very continuing effect on Jesus Christ and the land that he was born into, the people of that time. And that is specifically dealing with the two different captivities of Israel and Judea. And you can take your Bibles and go to 2 Kings, and we'll begin this. But before we start reading from 2 Kings, I want to give you just a little background in quick form of the history leading up to this point in time for the nation of Israel. Israel, for those that have no idea of the nation of Israel and where it gets started, it starts with one man, the man Jacob. So when it comes to the patriarchs, you have the great first one that's named after the flood anyway, and that being Abraham. And Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob. Okay? So Abraham's grandson was Jacob. And Jacob's name is later changed by God to Israel. Jacob has 12 sons. These are the 12 patriarchs, the 12 men that become the head of the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. When they are still just a big family, 11 of those sons sell the 12th son, Joseph, into slavery in Egypt. They're envious of him, and they sell him into slavery in Egypt, and that has all kinds of different effects. But besides Jacob saving his family and saving Egypt at the time and bringing great wealth into Egypt, the long-lasting effect was that his family stayed in Egypt once they came there to escape the famine that happened during that time. And they stayed there as they grew into a nation of people, such a great nation that Egypt got very nervous about them and made them slaves. And they cried unto God, and God sent Moses to go and get them out of Egypt. And so Moses led them out of Egypt, and this is the first time that we're dealing with Israel as a nation of people. He leads them out of Egypt. He leads them right up to the Promised Land. Joshua takes over and leads them into the Promised Land. And after Joshua, they are ruled for a long period of time by judges, men that listened to God and led according to what God said. But at some point, Israel decided they wanted a king. And so God gave them a king. The first one was Saul. He turned out to be not so great. Started off good, turned out to be not so great after that. The second one was David. He was the gold standard of kings. David was a man after God's own heart. He was a wonderful king. And at this point, it is one big kingdom comprised of all 12 tribes of Israel. Then David's son Solomon takes over, and Solomon starts off real great, but by the end of his life, he turns to idolatry. And God tells him that he is going to take the kingdom from him. Solomon has a son by the name of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is the king, and the people under him ask him to kind of lighten up because he's ruling them with a very heavy hand. Instead, he only lays it on harder, and they raise up another king to themselves, all of this being a result of what God had said would happen. That king was a man named Jeroboam. And Jeroboam became king over 10 of the tribes, which now becomes known as Israel. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, is over Judah, 2 of the tribes, Judah and one other, Benjamin. And the other 10 tribes are under another king, Jeroboam. So at this point, the kingdom divides. And we have a divided kingdom from that point on throughout the history of now Israel and Judah, as those 2 separate kingdoms are known to become. Both of those kingdoms, both the kingdom of Israel and Judah, both of them, more often than not, turn to idolatry. Israel pretty much always follows other gods. Judah has a few good kings along the way, but other than that, they also are in idolatry. And God warns them again and again and again that if they don't turn back to Him, they are going to go into captivity. Actually, they were warned this before they ever even got to the Promised Land. God told Moses that all this would happen, and they had plenty of warning to get away from it. At any rate, Israel was the worst of the two. Again, Israel is the bigger, 10 tribes. And they are the first ones to then be taken into captivity, and that occurs in 721 BC, and we'll read about it in 2 Kings chapter 17. In 2 Kings 17 and in verse 6 it says, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel into Assyria." So Hoshea is the king over Israel at this time. Israel's capital city is in Samaria. Jerusalem continues to be the capital city for Judah, but it is Samaria that is the capital city for Israel. So when you're reading different records in the Old Testament, records where some of the prophets are dealing with, and it talks about Samaria, the reason why that gets talked about so much was because it was the capital for Israel. Verse 7. I'm going to skip around quite a bit as I'm reading in this record. "For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the heathen." Verse 9. "And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God, and they built them high places in all their cities." We'll skip down to verse 16. "And they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal." Baal is the chief false god that they follow. But it says they worship the whole host of heaven, and it's not a heavenly host singing like, the angels. That's not what it's talking about. When all the host of heaven is talking about all the different gods that they could pray to. Verse 17, "And they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire." That's talking about human sacrifice by fire. When it says they passed through the fire, that means that they offered them up as burnt sacrifices. Sacrifices in the fire. A couple of those different gods like Molech and Cheneth were gods that required human sacrifice. "And they used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger." Verse 18, "Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only." So removing them out of his sight was that he allowed them to be taken captives by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were the greatest power on earth at this time. It's one of the first and great civilizations. And the nation or nations of Assyria, because they conquered many, they ruled that whole area. And they come and they take captive Israel, and they take them out of their land, and they take them and spread them out throughout all of the different kingdoms of Assyria. Verse 24, "And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria, and dwelt in the cities thereof." So not only did they take Israel out of their land and disperse them, which is the beginning of the first diaspora of Israel. Diaspora just means, not to be confused with diaspora, diaspora just means the dispersion, the scattering. But not only did he do that, but then he repopulated their land with peoples from those other lands surrounding them. He put other people into their houses. He put other people into their lands. Other people who brought with them their gods. And we won't take the time to read, but if you kept reading in this record, you'd find that what happened when these guys get there is now they're worshiping all of their different gods, and because all this evil's happening, they start getting eaten by lions. And they recognize that this is happening because they don't know how to worship the right God. So they appeal to their king, the king of Assyria, to do something about it. And he takes a priest that has been taken captive and sends him back to Samaria to teach these guys how to worship the right God. And they do that, along with all the other gods that they had been worshiping right along. So now you've got this real corruption. They're worshiping the true God, but they're also worshiping a bunch of false gods. And they're just mixing it all together and corrupting the right practices with idolatry. May have been one of the first times it happened. It certainly wasn't the last. In verse 41 of that chapter it says, "So these nations feared the Lord and served their graven images. Both their children and their children's children, as did their fathers, so do they unto this day." So that's the first of the captivities, the Assyrian captivity. What nation did that involve? Israel. How many tribes in Israel? 10. Ever heard the expression, the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Well, these are the folks, because they never come back. They just disappear. They become assimilated by all of those nations that they were carried away into. They buy the real estate. They start going to their churches and synagogues and temples and so on and so forth. They just get swallowed up by the land, and now they're just a part of everyone else. That's the end of Israel. That's the end of the 10 tribes known as the nation of Israel at that point in time. What about Judah? Well, Judah stayed free for another 120 years, but then beginning in 606 BC, they are taken into captivity by the Babylonians. It takes a period of, the Babylonian captivity doesn't happen all at once. It's not like one day they lose this war and boom, everybody's taken off, carried away, and that's that. There's an early invasion by Nebuchadnezzar and then a later invasion. And the first one, he had set up some leaders and so forth, and then they revolted, and then he's like, okay, I've had it. I'm going to wipe everybody out. I'm going to get everybody out of there. So the first one we read about in 2 Kings 24, verse 1. No, we're going to skip down. Verse 10. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. Besieged, they have it cut off. Nobody can go in, nobody can come out, no food can get in. Verse 13. And he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives. And all the craftsmen and smiths, none remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. And one of those ones that they carried off at this first early invasion was Daniel. Four of them, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These guys are all carried off in that early invasion. In chapter 25 of 2 Kings, you have the record of the final defeat of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. In verse 8, and in the 5th month, and this happens 597 BC, on the 7th day of the month, which is the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. And he burnt the house of the Lord, that's the temple, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire. And all the army of the Chaldees that were with the captain of the guard brake down the walls of Jerusalem round about. Now the rest of the people that were left in the city, and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon with the remnant of the multitude, did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. So anybody that had been left there from that first invasion, now they're carried out of there. And he burns down the temple, destroys the temple, and he destroys the walls of the city round about. All of that's wiped out. Now, that captivity is the one that's given a specific number of years in prophecies. God had told them that they would be in captivity 70 years. And that 70 years applies to Judah, not Israel, not the Assyrian captivity, because they never came back. But the Judeans were in captivity for 70 years. During that time, Babylon was defeated by the Persians. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia defeats Babylon. This is past the time of Nebuchadnezzar. He's dead, and his sons that are ruling. And he comes in and he defeats them, and now he takes over. He takes over Babylon, and he takes over all of those Judean captives that had been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar. But Cyrus is a good guy. And Cyrus tells them that they can return to their land. Now, they're still under his rule over all, but they're allowed to go back to their land. And they have permission to go back and permission to rebuild the temple, and eventually permission to rebuild the walls of the city, although that happens later, past Cyrus' time. That first begins, the first group to return from captivity happens in 538 BC. And then there's a period of time where everything's kind of stalled, but then Ezra leads a second group around 458 BC, and there's a third group led back to Judea by Nehemiah around 444 BC. And we'll read in Ezra chapter 1 about some of these events. Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, and we dealt with this recently, talking about Daniel and the Magi and all of that stuff. This is the leader, this is the land. That the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, and he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is God, which is in Jerusalem. Pretty cool, huh? So, they start heading back. Now, not all of them go back. Some of them remain. Daniel remained his whole life in Persia. And some remain, and different ones remain for different reasons. They may have been, like Daniel, put in a position of such importance and influence that they were serving God better by staying put than going back home. And others may have, just like the other ones earlier with the Assyrian captivity, just kind of got swallowed up or, got too comfortable with where they were living. But a huge portion of them, of the Judeans, do return to the land of Judah. So we have those two kingdoms, and in a future time I'll show you all this on a map when I deal with some of this stuff more. Israel was the northern kingdom. Judah was the southern kingdom. Israel included the regions of Samaria and Galilee, and we'll deal in greater detail about that when I go into answering why there was such an attitude toward those two groups of people. But these people come back into the land, but they come back into a land that is now a land where a lot of other people that had been sent there have kind of gotten all mixed in with the people that were there and the people that are returning. And all of that has a lot of different effects on the attitudes and some of the events that take place in the future, which we'll deal with at another time. In terms of the history of Israel that's recorded, of Israel and Judah that's recorded in the Old Testament, that return to the land is about where it all wraps up. You have them returning to the land, and in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and 2 Chronicles, these historical events are described where they do return to the land, where they do rebuild the temple, where they rebuild the walls of the city, where they do establish, and a lot of things that happen during that time also have great lasting effects on the peoples in that area. And we'll get into more of that detail once we get into the Gospels themselves. But there's a lot of history that still happens, even though it's not recorded in the Old Testament, before you get to the time of Jesus Christ. In that period of time that's covered after the end of 2 Chronicles, after the last prophet, Malachi, and before you get to Matthew. There's a 400-year period of time, roughly, that happens that is not part of the Bible. But we know a lot about those events and what happened from secular historians like Josephus, as well as the apocryphal and deuterocanonical books, such as the book of Maccabees and a couple of these others that are not rightfully part of the Bible, but do give some of the history of what happened during that time, and we'll be getting into that next time I dig into this subject.